It stood alone, beyond the reach of town gossip, yet close enough for its shadow to stretch into Fairhaven's conscience. A two-story house painted in bone white that the sun could never truly warm. St. Mary's Home for Girls was framed by drooping willow trees that seemed to bow in perpetual mourning, their thin branches swaying as though they knew the secrets hidden behind the orphanage's shuttered windows. The dirt road leading to the wrought iron gates wound through cotton fields that stretched to the horizon. Fields that looked beautiful from a distance but up close carried the sour smell of damp earth and rotting plant stalks. Locals called the place a refuge, a sanctuary for children with nowhere else to go, built by the pious Reverend Elias Crutchfield in 1821 after what he claimed was a divine vision. His sermons painted the home as a gift from God, a safe place for the innocent to heal and grow. But for every word of praise offered on Sunday mornings, there was an unspoken understanding that no girl ever seemed to leave St. Mary's alive beyond her 6th birthday. Those who lived near enough to see the lanterns flicker in the upstairs rooms at night would sometimes hear a faint rhythmic sound, not unlike a clock ticking, though it came in irregular beats. It was the kind of sound that stirred unease without explanation, a pulse in the air that set teeth on edge. The orphanage's white paint always looked newly applied, yet a closer look showed hairline cracks in the wood, as if the building itself resisted the facade. Fresh curtains were hung in the windows each season, delicate lace patterns meant to invite trust, but when the wind caught them and pulled them aside, passers-by swore they caught glimpses of pale faces peering out. Not with curiosity, but with a quiet, resigned fear. Fairhaven was a small town, bound together by its church and its dependence on the cotton trade. The Reverend's influence reached deep, and few dared to question the workings of St. Mary's. Families who surrendered their daughters spoke of poverty, of God's will, of having no other choice. The Reverend promised those girls a roof, food, and Christian education. For the first years of their lives, they appeared healthy, well-fed, and obedient. They sang hymns on Sundays, their little voices rising in harmony as the Reverend smiled down at them from the pulpit. Yet each year, without fail, another name was spoken softly during morning prayers, another life attributed to illness, accident, or divine calling. The graves were dug quickly, marked only with iron stakes, as if the earth should forget who had been placed within it. Inside the house, the air always smelled faintly of lavender soap, masking something sour beneath. A scent that clung to the walls, seeped into the bedding, and followed the staff like a second skin. The corridors were narrow, the floors polished to a mirror sheen, and the doors to certain rooms were kept locked at all hours. A grand staircase split the front hall, its banister polished by years of small hands gripping it tightly. At night, the house was eerily silent, except for the occasional groan of the wood underfoot, a sound that always seemed to come from places no one was standing. The Reverend kept his study on the 2nd floor, a room no child ever entered. Townsfolk whispered that even the staff stepped inside only when summoned, leaving quickly, their eyes lowered. There were small signs for those willing to see them. The way the older girls would withdraw from the younger ones as their 6th birthday approached, the way staff members spoke in hushed voices when passing certain doors, the pale, strained expressions of the women who washed linens in the yard. The orchard behind the orphanage was lush with fruit, but no child was ever seen playing there. Instead, they were kept in the front garden under constant watch, as though the back grounds were not safe for them. Or perhaps they were not safe for the grounds. The Reverend himself was a man of careful manners, always immaculately dressed, his voice calm and measured. He spoke of God's mercy and the salvation of children's souls with a conviction that stirred both comfort and unease. In his presence there was a sense of something measured and exacting, as though every movement, every word was part of a private calculation. He had the gaze of a man who saw people not as they were, but as pieces in a design only he understood. For those in Fairhaven who tried to convince themselves of St. Mary's goodness, the pattern was easy to dismiss. Illness took children quickly in the South. Accidents were common. But for others, the truth pressed against their minds like a weight they could not shake. The girls arrived, they grew, they smiled, and then, as surely as the seasons turned, they were gone. It was said quietly late at night over kitchen tables or outside the church after service. At St. Mary's, no girl survived to see her 7th year. And yet the gates remained open. The cotton fields swayed gently in the breeze, and the house at the edge of the field stood untouched, its white facade gleaming like the teeth of something waiting patiently to feed. The ledger began as a gift no one questioned, a calfskin book with iron clasps that clicked like teeth when shut, kept in the dim corner of the Reverend's study where the light never quite reached. Years ago, the town clerk delivered it with pride, the pages blank and bright. Now the paper held a hush and its edges were faintly pink, as if once rinsed in watered blood and left to dry against the spine. Whoever wrote inside loved order more than breath. Each name moved across the page in clean strokes, letters spaced with patient cruelty, a ruler's mind guiding a steady hand. At the end of every entry, after a date that closed a life, the same tiny mark appeared, a cross so delicate it looked like a hair laid on paper. There were no causes listed, no mention of fever or fall. The ledger did not speak in reasons, only in conclusions. It smelled of lavender from the clothes that wiped the desk, and beneath that lingered a metallic tang, like rain resting in a rusted pan. When lifted, the book felt heavier than paper should be, as if ink had turned to iron or sorrow itself had weight. Reverend Elias Crutchfield kept the key on a narrow chain under his collar and opened the book with a gentleness that felt like ownership. Only 2 others ever touched it, the deacon who recorded donations and the woman in white gloves who dusted the study and never left a print. In the beginning, the entries came slowly, a name or 2 each season. Then the pattern hardened into habit. Lines multiplied after rain, and each line ended the same way, with that careful cross that kept feeling from spilling into the margins. Sometimes a name was so short it looked like a cough. Sometimes the pen paused and resumed with greater care, as if the writer feared a tremor might betray him. The ledger's comfort was simple. Grief domesticated, disaster arranged into columns. People entrusted to see it felt calmer afterward, as if neatness could make the world harmless. Yet at night, when storms walked the fields and pressed their hands to the window frames, the clasps ticked with the changing air and the corners of pages lifted as if something beneath them breathed. In daylight, the Reverend laid his palm on the cover like a doctor measuring a pulse, unlocked it, and set down one more name. The copybook beneath did not tally money. It counted days between arrivals and endings, the distance between birthdays and that final date, a spacing that looked less like record-keeping and more like timing. A notch cut into the inside board had deepened from use. Once the deacon slid his thumbnail there and felt grit that was not dust, a mineral drag that tasted of coins on his tongue. He told no one about the pale rosied streaks the cleaning rags carried after touching the book. Stained soap could not lift. Fairhaven never saw the ledger, only felt its verdicts ripple through mornings of black dresses and quiet yards. When whispers grew bold, the Reverend spoke of God's will, and the closed book stood beside him like a silent witness with perfect memory. The newest leaves showed spaces saved under the last dates, tiny breaths the hand seemed to hold for what came after, as if something had to be done before the entry was complete. That unwritten part lived elsewhere, but in habits the ledger could not show. A gentle figure moving through halls with a lullaby under her breath and gloves that caught the light like water, the one who took the neat arithmetic of names and turned it into something the body could not survive. They called her Sister Mercy Whitlow, and the girls trusted her touch, not knowing the ledger trusted her more than any prayer could. Sister Mercy Whitlow arrived at St. Mary's long before most could remember. A pale, thin woman who seemed stitched into her habit, her voice carrying the slow cadence of a hymn half forgotten. Her gloves were always white, not the soft cotton worn by ladies to church, but kid leather stretched so tight they gleamed faintly as if polished. The girls were told they were to keep germs away, but the truth felt older than medicine. She wore them even in the swelter of summer when the other women fanned themselves and unbuttoned their collars. No one ever saw her bare hands, and those who had worked beside her long enough learned not to wonder aloud. She moved quietly, gliding from room to room like a thought you cannot shake, her footsteps muffled by the wood as though the house itself made space for her. In the dormitories, she was a figure of comfort, tucking blankets to the chin, smoothing hair with a gloved palm, her voice no louder than a breath. To the children, her presence meant safety. They leaned into her touch, unaware of the sharpness concealed beneath. The gloves hid fingernails filed to perfect gleaming points, not jagged like claws, but tools shaped with care over years. These were no accident of habit. They were honed for a specific purpose. When the time came, she could press her hand lightly against a small throat, a gesture that felt almost like affection, and apply just enough force in the right places to rupture the tiniest vessels beneath the skin without leaving a single bruise. The air would leave the lungs quietly, the heartbeat slowing under her steady pressure. The eyes wide and unfocused long before the mouth could open to cry out. Death came like sleep, though the body fought in ways too small for anyone outside the room to hear. She kept a ritual of preparation that no one questioned. In the days before a girl's 6th birthday, Sister Mercy would begin to visit more often, lingering by the bed at night, brushing the hair back from the forehead, her gloved fingers measuring the curve of the neck in motions that seemed tender. Sometimes she would hum to herself while watching the child eat, her gaze fixed not on the face but on the hollow just above the collarbone. At laundry time, she would separate a particular pillowcase and take it away before anyone could wash it. Later, it would return smelling faintly of something metallic under the starch, its fibers denser as if stiffened by a hidden lining. The staff treated her with quiet respect that bordered on fear. When she entered a room, conversation softened, eyes lowered. She never raised her voice, never lost composure, yet people moved out of her way without thinking. The Reverend trusted her more than any other. She alone was permitted in his study without knocking, her work so bound to his that it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. She handled the ledger as if it were part of her own body, fingertips tracing the newest cross before she closed the clasps. In town, she appeared at church beside the Reverend, her gloves folded neatly in her lap during the sermon, her expression serene. Mothers greeted her with gratitude, telling themselves that such a calm, gentle woman must be a blessing to the children. None of them could imagine the quiet hours after evening prayers, when she moved through the upstairs hallway with a single candle, pausing at certain doors. She would slip inside, her shadow stretching across the bed, and lean down until her gloved hand rested over a sleeping chest. Sometimes she would simply listen to the breath, counting under her own. Other nights, she would remain until the breath began to falter, until her touch became the last sensation the child would ever feel. When it was over, she worked with deliberate care. The gloves would be rinsed in water laced with lavender, the nails checked for any sign of dullness, then wrapped in a linen cloth until they gleamed again. She would kneel at the side of the bed for a moment, head bowed as though in prayer, though whether for the soul of the dead or for the perfection of the act, No one could say. By morning she would be at breakfast pouring porridge, smiling faintly and speaking in that same low, comforting tone. To the living she was a guardian. To the reverend she was precision-made flesh. To the ledger she was the hand that kept the pattern unbroken. The ticking began as a nuisance no one could locate, a faint metallic click that rose through the floorboards at night and faded by morning, leaving only a nervous tremor in the girls who heard it. It did not keep steady time like a clock. It lurched and paused, quickened and stuttered, as if something hidden were practicing how to mimic a heartbeat. The staff called it settling wood or rats because believing anything else would mean admitting the house had a will. In truth, the sound came from the attic above the dormitory, where a narrow hatch opened into heat and dust and a space that smelled of oil and old straw. At the center stood a metal cradle mounted on curved iron runners, its sides woven of fine wire like a basket meant to hold light rather than weight. A hand crank at one end fed into a nest of toothed wheels, each gear slightly imperfect, the teeth uneven so that every turn threw the rhythm off by a breath. A tray under the head held a shallow dish of water, and on calmer nights a bead would quiver with each jolt and then settle, the surface returning to glass before the next shiver woke it again. No one outside the Reverend and Sister Mercy knew the hatch key, though sometimes a thin scrape reached the ceiling below. The sound of leather against iron and the slow grind that meant the cradle was being wound for another hour. When a child neared her 6th birthday, the device ran most in the week before, the irregular rocking working more reliably than sermons to unspool the mind. The wire bed did not bruise. It kissed the back with a pattern that faded by morning, leaving only a memory of being held and shaken by something that never tired. The point was not to rest. The point was to teach the body to fear sleep, to make the nervous system live on the brink long enough that small signals failed to travel the way nature meant. Down below, the dormitory breathed in a single animal rhythm until the clicking began. Then breath split into separate panics, each child's chest climbing and stopping and starting again as if learning to breathe from the machine. After the 3rd night, eyelids refused to settle even when the room fell quiet. After the 5th, the smallest noises sounded like blows. After the 6th, the girls lay still and watched darkness change shape. Sister Mercy came then with a soft cloth and cool water and praised their bravery. Her gloved fingers smoothing hair damp with fear while her eyes measured how long the pupils clung to the candlelight. She would mark a tiny cross in her memory at the first sign of tremor, the slight flutter that means the spine has begun to misfire, and from that point she needed only a touch to finish what the cradle had started. Above them, the gears did not argue with conscience. They asked for turning and gave back motion, their teeth chewing at times until it frayed. On nights when wind moved through the willow leaves, the cradle's runners made a faint hiss like whispers, and the wires gave a sound almost too high to hear, the plea of metal wanting rest. The room's single window was painted shut, a square of moonlight more than air, and the dust turned in it like thoughts no one confessed. Sometimes the Reverend stood at the hatch and listened, not to the machine but to the silence that followed each stutter. The pause where a mind waits and expects pain, where the body teaches itself that mercy never arrives. He liked that pause. It meant the device had entered the spine and taken a seat there. A shallow groove had worn into the floor beside the crank where Sister Mercy's heel always found its place, a human mark beside the machine's indifferent script. The girls learned to fear the evening light because it was the color the ceiling took just before the first click. They learned to keep their hands still when the urge to cover their ears burned, because movement invited attention, and attention invited questions, and questions invited the hallway footsteps that never ended well. Then the clicking started again, hesitant at first, testing the wood. and the girls held themselves rigid so their beds would not betray their shaking. On the rare nights when storms drowned the sound, their bodies twitched as if they had swallowed the rhythm and could not get it out. What began as nuisance became ritual, and ritual taught obedience, and obedience invited the final touch. When the wheel at last stuttered to quiet and the wire cradle settled into its stop, the girls below stared at the dark with eyes that did not close even when the lids fell. Below, a candlestick moved through a corridor and stopped at a door that already knew it would open, a gloved hand hovering just long enough to honor the night's design, and the ledger's next blank line waited with the patience of iron. Waiting. The 6th birthday at St. Mary's was never greeted with laughter, though the day began with the same staged cheer each time. In the morning, the chosen child was dressed in a fresh muslin gown, the fabric so white it seemed to drink in the light. The women in the kitchen baked a small loaf of sweet bread, its scent winding through the corridors, and the other girls were told to hum hymns as the day moved forward. A crown of pressed violets was set on the child's head, the petals still damp with morning dew, leaving faint purple marks on the hair. Sister Mercy would take the girl's hand and lead her to the small side room off the main hall, where the Reverend stood waiting with a shallow silver basin and a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. The ritual was never seen by outsiders. The chapel doors were locked from within, and the key turned twice before the lamps were lit. The room was narrow, the walls lined with candles set in heavy iron sconces that bled wax down the stone in frozen drips. The air inside was warm, thick with the mingled smell of wax-damp wood, and the faint metallic tang that lived in this place no matter how often it was scrubbed. At the center stood the altar carved from a single block of cedar, its top smooth from years of hands and cloths, its edges grooved in narrow channels that ran toward the front, where the silver basin waited to catch whatever those grooves would deliver. The Reverend would begin with scripture, his voice low and measured, speaking of purity, angels, and the journey to the kingdom. But the words were not for comfort. They were a binding, a slow weaving of the child's mind into the fabric of inevitability. Sister Mercy would stand behind the girl, her gloved hands resting lightly on her shoulders, pressing just enough to remind her of their weight. No one spoke of what came after the prayers, yet the air in the chapel seemed to shift, growing heavier, as if the walls themselves leaned closer to hear. When the final psalm faded, the child would be guided forward to kneel at the altar. The crown of violets was adjusted, petals trembling with each shallow breath. The Reverend's hands, steady and pale, would take a small vial from the shelf beneath the altar, its contents a cloudy fluid that smelled faintly of crushed herbs, but stung the eyes when its scent reached them. A few drops would be poured onto the child's crown, darkening the petals and sending rivulets down into the hair. Sister Mercy would lower her hands to the girl's jaw, fingers curving with the precision of someone who had repeated this act countless times. The Reverend would speak again, though by now his words were almost lost under the sound of the child's breathing, which had quickened in the stillness. The moment itself was quiet. There was no cry, no struggle that could be heard beyond the locked doors. Sister Mercy's grip was firm and unshakable, her gloves pressing in exactly the right places to silence the body from within. The Reverend would watch the eyes as they lost their focus, timing the drop of the head so that it happened in sync with the end of the prayer. The basin caught what the grooves delivered, sometimes only a thin stream, sometimes more, depending on how the body chose to give. The candles seemed to bend their light toward the altar, shadows closing in as though they too wished to witness. When it was done, the crown was removed, the petals now heavy and wilted. The child was lifted carefully, her limbs slack, and carried through the narrow door behind the altar that led to the preparation room. There, the body would be laid on a narrow table, the hair combed flat, the face washed, and the gown adjusted to hide the stillness beneath. Sister Mercy would tend to the gloves, wiping them clean with a cloth dipped in lavender water, while the Reverend returned to the altar to murmur a final verse. The basin would be emptied into a hole dug beneath the stone floor, covered again so that no trace remained by morning. By dawn, the chapel was as it had been. Candles replaced, floor swept, the altar polished to a dull shine. The muslin gown would be folded and stored to be washed and used again for the next girl. Only the faint metallic scent lingered, clinging to the cedar and the grooves that no amount of scrubbing could erase. The staff would speak in softer voices for a few days, and the other children would avoid looking at the empty bed in the dormitory. Outside the chapel, life continued. The cotton fields swayed in the morning breeze, the willows whispered over the gravel path, and the white facade of St. Mary's gleamed in the sun. In town, another family whispered their guilt into the church pews, telling themselves their daughter was in a better place, safe from hunger and cold. But in the locked drawer of the Reverend's desk, the ledger had already been opened, the name written in its perfect hand, the tiny cross inked at the end. And somewhere above the dormitory, the cradle waited, its gears still and silent for now, but ready to rock again when the next birthday approached. Skeletal and deliberate, Dr. Thaddeus Finch arrived at St. Mary's with a hush that taught people to lower their voices. He carried 2 leather cases that smelled of oil and salt, their metal feet finding old dents on the Reverend's desk as if the wood remembered him. His eyes were river water before a storm, his hands moving like trained instruments. Girls nearing 6 were sent to the infirmary, while Sister Mercy stood with a basin and folded linen, a picture of care that needed no words. On the table lay a narrow pillow with hidden channels to guide the neck where pressure would count, the sheet pulled tight so no movement could pretend to be comfortable. Finch listened first. Stethoscope low along the spine to harvest the tiny murmurs bones make when they are asked to carry fear. Then came the taps. Small weighted hammers that clicked into a brass collar. Each head tuned to a number in a blue thread notebook. He struck not to bruise but to send notes through the column of nerves, watching for late twitches and shortened breaths the way a conductor watches a weak section. When the knee failed to jump, when toes curled half a second too late, he wrote with calm satisfaction, because delay meant the body had learned to expect pain and would accept instruction. Between taps, he steadied the chin and counted swallows, measuring a throat that would soon obey a quieter order. Sometimes he poured a draught tasting of anise and metal. As eyes watered, he slipped a spoon beneath the tongue to steal it, telling himself silence made readings clean. A leather strap crossed the chest when tremor spoiled the page, but he preferred cooperation and relied on the attic cradle's lessons already written into their nights. At the base of the skull, he pressed a cold tin disc and turned a screw until a small nerve admitted surrender with a flutter. He stopped there and smiled without joy. His gentlest test hid inside kindness, a lullaby in steady meter while his fingers traced ribs, guiding breath into the song, then a sudden pause to watch panic bloom when music vanished. In his cases lay bells no larger than buttons, a tuning fork, blunt pins for mapping, tiny wedges for jaws, and a roll of silk to bandage sight until the world became only touch and sound. The pins were for territory, the silk for shrinking it, the wedges for keeping the larynx still while he watched how the voice trembled like a trapped moth. In the days after, some girls spoke with threads of sound so thin the staff called it shyness. Sister Mercy slid the sign onto the Reverend's blotter, because a thinner voice meant the path to stillness stood clear. Finch cleaned his tools, drawing lint from screw collars, aligning the ledger of reactions with the ledger of names so no blank line would surprise them. When rain worked the roof, he was almost kind because weather hid the tiny sounds bodies make when they give up. He did not speak of mercy or justice. He spoke in measurements. The Reverend watched from the doorway, learning what he needed and nothing more, while Sister Mercy stood close enough to catch a falling head. In town, they said the doctor treated fevers and crooked spines. The girls returned pale, and no one asked why the infirmary candles burned to stubs on those days. He believed terror becomes habit. Habit becomes reflex, and reflex can be stopped by a touch at the right angle, so he trained reflex with taps, with pauses, with practiced mercy that felt like rehearsal. He trained it until breath begged for the release he would not grant. At dusk, his cuffs were crisp and his shoes clean, but in his pocket sat 2 neat rings of hair cut from the napes of 2 small necks, proof to himself that nerves live near memory and that memory can be thinned like cloth. In the ledger, a new cross waited. In the chapel, the cedar grooves shone with oil. In the dormitory, the cradle stood quiet but not at rest, its gears remembering every turn. Down the hall, Sister Mercy lifted a cup to a mouth that had stopped arguing with liquid, and Finch closed his case with a click that sounded to anyone passing like relief. Beneath the laundry, where steam fogged the windows and soap sloshed in tubs, a narrow door hid behind hanging sheets, its handle chalky with lime that burned the skin. Beyond it, a stairway sank into damp and darkness until the air grew cold enough to sting teeth. The chamber below was small and square, the bricks sweating. The floor sloped toward a grate that never dried. At the center sat an iron cistern sunk into the ground, its rim polished by years of gloved hands. Rain from the roof fed it, quicklime poured in until the water turned cloudy white, looking harmless until breath met it. Sister Mercy knew the depths, the angles, the seconds between panic and surrender. She called it cleansing in front of others. Alone she called it softening, because the purpose was not death. It was to rinse away the spark that argued inside a child until it flickered small. The chosen girl came under the excuse of a wash, her eyes dulled from the attic cradle and Dr. Finch's tuning. Lanterns set around the cistern threw light across the ceiling like moving water. Sister Mercy sat close, knees against iron to feel the shiver as the water took a body. She loosened the blanket, spoke in a tone that stroked the ear and lowered the head into a shallow notch at the rim so the mouth brushed the surface and opened by reflex. The first swallow shocked, a cough tucked into the water, but her arms were steady, the angle precise. She counted to 7, lifted for air, counted to 9, lowered again. Each immersion longer than the last, teaching the brain that breath returned only when it stopped insisting. Between dips, she pressed on the chest to herd the lungs, stroked the brow until the eyes unfocused and tears slid into the hairline. The lime stung, the cold gnawed, and the heart learned a new rhythm. Wait, obey, accept. Too soon and the fight remained, too long and the body left for good. She found the border by feel, listening through the bones in her hands. When the child sagged, not from sleep but from emptied will, Sister Mercy lifted her clear, wrapped her in towels warmed by the kitchen stove. She rubbed the small hands until color returned, spooned broth into a mouth that no longer argued, then walked her slowly around the room until legs remembered their work. A touch at the neck made the head tilt. A pause in step made breath pause, too. Girls who climbed those stairs moved as if still underwater. Careful and quiet, their laughter reduced to a ghost of sound. The staff praised the calm and never asked how it had been won. Sometimes the Reverend watched from the doorway, eyes on the tank where bubbles gathered and broke. He admired cleanliness that reached the soul and methods that left no mark a coroner could name. Hooks on the wall held towels and a coil of rope the color of damp straw, rarely used but ready if panic returned. In the corner, a slate carried chalk marks wiped away before dawn. Times and counts meaningless to anyone who didn't know the code. After each session, the surface was skimmed for hair or petals shed too early. Fresh lime stirred in until the water regained its false purity. Steam from the laundry above carried away any cry, so the house never heard. The laundry women sometimes found towels heavier than they should be and folded them without comment. When the room was empty, its air grew still, the pale ring of lime settling along the cistern walls like a faint halo. It was not a place of death. That was the chapel's work. This was preparation, the quiet breaking that made the final ritual smooth, dignified, and without resistance. In the stillness after, Sister Mercy would sometimes linger, her gloved fingertips resting on the rim as if feeling for the memory of the last heartbeat it had held. The cistern gave nothing back. It waited, patient as stone, for the next small body to learn how to surrender without a sound. The velvet pouch was kept in the Reverend's locked cabinet, nestled among folded linens and tied with a strip of pale ribbon. Sister Mercy handled it as if it were a holy relic, lifting it with both hands and setting it on the altar table where the candlelight could touch the fabric. Inside lay tools that did not belong to any surgeon's kit. Tiny handles carved from smooth bone, each tipped with a slender blade of polished ivory. They were not purchased nor fashioned from animal remains. Every one of those blades had once been the tooth of a girl who had died at St. Mary's. The Reverend had taken them himself, rinsed them in wine, and carved them down until they gleamed like the edge of a needle. Sister Mercy called them the angel's teeth, and to her they were more than instruments. They were a lineage, a way of binding the present to the dead. She would unwrap them with care, laying them out in order of size on a length of white cloth. The smallest were no longer than a matchstick, meant for the delicate work at the crown of a child's head. The largest curved slightly like a tiny scythe, sharp enough to slice without tearing. The chosen blade was decided before the ritual began, matched to the girl's hair texture and skull shape, so the incision would be clean, the circle perfect. The act took place only after the final breath had left the body, in the preparation room behind the chapel. The muslin gown would already be smoothed, the hands arranged at the chest. Sister Mercy would kneel, gloved fingers parting the hair until the scalp showed pale beneath. The blade kissed the skin in a small, deliberate arc, then another until a neat circle was freed, no larger than the mouth of a teacup. There was no haste. The blade moved with the patience of someone stitching fine lace. The Reverend stood nearby, holding a square of linen to receive the piece. It was pressed flat between weighted boards, the blood drawn out into blotting paper, then dried until it was as thin and light as parchment. On its underside, the faint whirls of the skin's pattern remained, as unique as the child's voice had been. Once dried, the circle was labeled with the girl's initials and the date, then placed in a small cedar box with the others. These relics were never shown to outsiders, though their number grew steadily, each one a silent testimony to the pattern St. Mary's never broke. The Reverend believed the scalp circles held the essence of the child's obedience, the final surrender that made the body easy to claim. He said nothing of this to the staff, but when he handled the box, his fingers lingered. The girls, of course, knew nothing of the pouch or its contents. They only saw the crown of violets on the day of the ritual and felt Sister Mercy's hands adjusting it on their head. They could not imagine that those same hands would later hold the angel's teeth, drawing a circle where the flowers had been, marking them forever in a way the ground could not erase. Beneath the chapel, in a hollow cut into the earth, the Reverend had dug a narrow trench beneath the altar. It was here the scalp circles were buried in bundles wrapped in linen, each tied with black thread. The cedar box was emptied when it grew too full, and the ground under the altar grew rich with what he called holy remains, He told himself they nourished the sacred space, binding it to the purity of those who had ascended. Sister Mercy said nothing, only pressed the soil down with her gloved hands until it was smooth again. By morning, the tools were washed in wine and dried, slipped back into the velvet pouch, the ribbon tied in the same neat bow. They would rest there until the next name in the ledger reached its cross, and when that day came, the pouch would be brought out again, the angel's teeth laid in order, each one remembering the flesh it had once come from, and the work it was made to do. It was meant to be an ordinary morning departure. 3 girls, pale from weeks of illness, were wrapped in wool shawls and led to the waiting carriage behind the orchard wall. The Reverend told the staff they were being sent to the city infirmary, that the doctor there would give them the kind of care St. Mary's could not. Sister Mercy oversaw the loading, tucking the girls inside as if for a long journey, placing a folded blanket over their knees. She closed the door with a quiet finality and stepped back, the driver flicking the reins to set the horses moving. No one in Fairhaven saw them leave. By mid-afternoon, smoke rose from a ditch 3 miles down the road. A farmer was first to find it. The carriage overturned, one wheel shattered, the interior blackened and smoldering. The smell was thick and oily, not the clean wood smoke of a hearth, but the sour burn of cloth and flesh. He swore he heard faint cries when he approached. Short, panicked sounds swallowed quickly by the crackle of fire. But by the time he reached the wreck, there was only the hiss of wet earth steaming where he had thrown water from a bucket. The horses were gone, the driver nowhere in sight. Inside, the seats had collapsed into a heap of char and ash. No bodies were found. When the news reached the Reverend, he gathered the staff in the main hall and spoke of tragedy. He said bandits were likely to blame, that the roads were unsafe for the sick and weak. His voice was steady, almost resigned, as if this had been the risk they all lived with. The townsfolk whispered but did not press. In Fairhaven, questioning the Reverend meant inviting God's disapproval. Still, the story sat wrong with some. The road where the carriage burned was too close to an unused spur, a rutted track that disappeared into the woods, a place where the smell of charred wood lingered for days, and the soil beneath was darker than the earth around it. Those who had seen the 3 girls before they left remembered their silence, the way their eyes seemed to follow nothing, as though they had already been taken somewhere else in their minds. No one could say why they had been sent away together, or why the infirmary in the city later claimed no such patients had arrived. The sheriff's investigation lasted less than a week. He visited the site once, took statements from the farmer and 2 travelers, then closed his notes with a shake of the head. Officially, the case was marked as an accident. Cause unknown. But the staff of St. Mary's knew the truth in the way their routines shifted afterward. The laundry boiled extra sheets for no stated reason. The Reverend spent long hours in his study with the ledger open, adding nothing but running his fingers down its pages as though confirming the order of things. Sister Mercy avoided the orchard for days, as if the wall that hid the carriage from the main road still held the sound of the cries. In the months that followed, the burned carriage faded into memory, replaced by newer arrivals, newer birthdays, newer rituals. The charred metal frame was hauled into the woods and left to rust, its blackened boards collapsing into the undergrowth. Sometimes, on warm evenings when the wind carried scents from the fields, a faint trace of that oily smoke seemed to drift back toward town. Those who noticed it did not mention it aloud. At St. Mary's, the beds were filled again. The cradle in the attic ticked and swayed. The Reverend wrote another name in the ledger, and somewhere far from the road, in ground that was never marked, the missing pieces of that morning's journey lay buried where the fire had not reached. Hollis Boone had dug graves for 40 years, his back bent from seasons of lifting earth, his hands gnarled like the roots he cut through. He was not a man given to confession, but in the final week of his life, fever loosening his mind, he called for the parish clerk and pressed a folded scrap of paper into his hand. The paper was rough, torn from the corner of an old feed sack, and upon it a crude map had been drawn in charcoal. A crooked rectangle marked the orchard behind St. Mary's, with a scatter of X marks clustering near the far wall. Hollis whispered that each X was a burial, that the Reverend had called him in the dead of night to dig holes no larger than a cradle, holes that were to be filled before sunrise and never spoken of again. Hollis said he never saw a coffin carried from the house. The girls were brought wrapped in blankets, limp as dolls, placed in the earth as they were. He was paid in silver coins wrapped in cloth, the Reverend's voice calm as he gave instructions. Sister Mercy watching from the shadow of the willow trees. The work was quick, silent, and final. Hollis claimed the soil there was richer than anywhere else on the grounds, always dark and damp, as if it remembered. When the clerk passed the map to a few trusted townsfolk, they waited for a night without the moon and went to the orchard with shovels. They chose one of the nearer marks, scraping through roots and stone until the blade struck wood. The coffin was barely 3 feet long, its boards warped from years underground. When they pried it open, what lay inside was not a full body, only the lower half of a skeleton, the bones yellow and brittle, wrapped in the remnants of muslin. The rest was gone. No head, no ribs, no arms, just legs curled awkwardly as though the body had been cut apart and only part of it consigned to the dirt. The men reburied what they found, tamping the soil flat, the air around them heavy with the kind of silence that swallows questions. No one wanted to believe there was truth in Hollis's map, but each X was a wound waiting underfoot. The orchard, once the pride of St. Mary's, became a place no child dared wander. Even in daylight, the space between the trees felt wrong. The shade too deep, the wind too still. When the word of the digging reached the Reverend, he called it blasphemy. He stood before the congregation, his voice low and grave, warning against those who would desecrate holy ground with suspicion and shovels. The map was dismissed as the ravings of a dying man, the bones explained away as remnants from some older, forgotten cemetery. Yet the orchard remained locked behind a gate, the key hanging in Sister Mercy's apron pocket. The gravedigger's map vanished soon after, burned in a hearth no one admitted to tending. But for the men who had opened that coffin, its contents never left their thoughts. They remembered the unnatural stillness of those bones, the deliberate absence of the rest, and the faint smell that rose from the soil. Not decay, but something sharp and chemical, as if the ground itself had been treated to keep secrets. At night, when the orchard's shadows reached toward the house, they imagined the rest of the graves, each with its own missing pieces. They wondered if the Reverend kept them somewhere, if Sister Mercy tended them the way she tended the ledger and the pouch of ivory blades. And they wondered how many X marks on that map had been drawn with absolute accuracy, and how many were still waiting to be made. It was the summer of 1837 when a traveling preacher came through Fairhaven, his voice rough from road dust but strong enough to gather a crowd. He spoke on the green outside the church, his sermon a burning rope of accusation aimed directly at St. Mary's home. He said the Lord had shown him a house that wore the skin of charity but hid the bones of the damned, a place where children's voices were silenced in God's name. By evening, his words had passed through every tavern, kitchen, and pew in town. At dusk, the people came, farmers with their tools still in hand, merchants in their shirt sleeves, mothers clutching their youngest children. They lit torches and walked the road to St. Mary's, the glow ahead of them like a second sunset. The Reverend met them at the gates, standing tall in his black coat, Sister Mercy at his side, her gloves folded neatly. He did not shout or threaten. Instead, he invited them in. The gates creaked open and the crowd spilled onto the gravel path. Inside, the halls gleamed under lamplight. The floors shone. The air was warm with the smell of bread from the kitchen. Girls stood in neat rows, their hair combed, their eyes bright but watchful. The Reverend moved among them, laying a hand gently on each shoulder, speaking of the care they received, the schooling, the safety. He took the townsfolk through the dormitories where beds were made with hospital corners, blankets smooth as stone. In the infirmary, jars of herbs and neatly rolled bandages lined the shelves. Not a single mark or shadow betrayed what these walls had held. The preacher who had accused him walked behind, searching every corner, every shadow. He asked to see the cellar, and the Reverend obliged, leading him to the door at the end of the hall. The crowd followed down the narrow steps into a space lined with shelves of dried food, barrels of water, and neatly stacked firewood. The preacher's eyes scanned every inch, but there was no sign of anything unholy. What he did not know, what none of them could have guessed, was that the true cellar lay beyond the wall behind the confessional, a door invisible unless you knew to feel for the small metal catch hidden in the molding. Behind that wall, in darkness they never touched, dozens of small bodies floated in brine-filled barrels, the skin pale and preserved, eyes closed as if still dreaming. The Reverend had sealed the space himself, packing the cracks so no smell could escape, no hint of damp or decay to betray him. As the crowd climbed back into the hall, they felt almost ashamed of their suspicion. The Reverend thanked them for their concern, assured them that their vigilance kept the community strong, and sent them back into the night with his blessing. By the time they reached the green again, their torches burned low, and the preacher's voice sounded less certain. Some muttered apologies, others said nothing at all. The accusation dissolved into rumor, and rumor thinned into nothing. The Reverend returned to his study and wrote 3 new names in the ledger before extinguishing the lamp. In the days that followed, life in Fairhaven resumed its rhythm. The orchard gate stayed locked, the attic cradle remained wound, and the drowning room waited for its next pupil. Yet a quiet shift had taken place. The Reverend now knew exactly how far he could go before the town turned back. He had seen their hesitation, their hunger to be reassured, and he understood that truth could be drowned as easily as a child if you held it under long enough. In the chapel, Sister Mercy stood at the altar in the dim afternoon light, the velvet pouch of angel's teeth beside her. She smoothed the cloth, humming softly, while in the hidden cellar the barrels stood silent, the brine catching the lamplight that leaked through the cracks. Somewhere above, in the empty hallways, the last of the crowd's footsteps faded. St. Mary's had survived the night untouched, its doors still open, its face as clean and white as the day it was built. Lila Gray was not like the others. She had come to St. Mary's at 3 years old after her parents drowned in the river. A bright-eyed child with a habit of staring out windows as if she could see something far beyond the fields. By her 6th birthday, the cradle in the attic had already done its work. Her nights were shallow, her hands trembled at sudden sounds. But there was a stubborn ember in her that the Reverend had not yet managed to smother. Sister Mercy noticed it in the way Lila's gaze lingered on doors, on the line where the floor met the wall, as though she were mapping the place in her mind. On the morning of her birthday, Lila was dressed in the muslin gown, crowned with pressed violets that still held a trace of dew. The other girls sang the hymn, their voices thin and obedient. Sister Mercy took her hand, guiding her toward the chapel. Lila walked without protest, but her eyes never left the windows that lined the hall. The Reverend was already waiting at the altar, the silver basin polished to a mirror. The candles dripped steady lines of wax, the air thick with the scent of cedar and something metallic. The prayers began, low and measured, binding the moment as they always had. Sister Mercy's gloved hands rested on Lila's small shoulders, her grip steady. But as the Reverend's voice rolled over the final verse, Lila's breathing shifted. Her chest rose and fell faster, her eyes darting toward the faint outline of the side door behind the altar. When the Reverend stepped forward with the vial, Lila moved, a small, sharp twist of her body breaking from Sister Mercy's grip in a way no child had before. The violet scattered as she bolted for the door, her bare feet slapping the wood. Sister Mercy lunged, but Lila was quick, the desperation in her stride carrying her into the narrow passage behind the altar. She ran down the corridor, the cold air of the storage room rushing against her face, the echo of pursuit close behind. She burst through the outer door into the orchard, the sky split by a sudden clap of thunder. The ground was soft from rain, sucking at her feet as she sprinted toward the low wall at the far edge. Behind her, Sister Mercy's voice called her name, not loud, but enough to twist the air with the weight of command. Lila didn't look back. Lightning lit the cotton fields beyond the wall, a pale, endless sea. She reached the stones and began to climb, her fingers scraping against the moss-slick surface. The first attempt failed. Her hands slipped, and she hit the ground hard enough to knock the breath from her. She scrambled up again, her palms bleeding now, skin peeling where the stone bit deep. Rain poured over her crownless head, blurring her vision, but she clung to the top and hauled herself over. In the field beyond, the cotton bent low under the storm's wind, stalks whipping her legs as she stumbled forward. Her breath came ragged, each inhale a gasp against the weight of the air. Somewhere behind her, the orchard gate slammed. She didn't turn to see who had followed. The world narrowed to the pounding of her heart, the pull of the wet earth, and the hope, irrational but blazing, that the open land could save her. Days later, she was found. A search party made up of townsfolk who had heard whispers of the escape discovered her body where the cotton thinned into wild grass. She lay on her side, one hand curled as if still reaching forward. The skin of her palms was worn away raw from the wall she had climbed. Her eyes were open, clouded with rainwater, yet there was something in them that hadn't been washed out, a flicker of refusal that had survived even as the body gave in. The Reverend claimed she had wandered off during the storm and succumbed to exposure. No one questioned him openly, but a quiet murmur passed through the town. Lila's name never appeared in the ledger. No cross was drawn beside it. It was as if she had been erased, her absence made official by omission. The staff buried her without ceremony in the far corner of the grounds, away from the orchard and the chapel. Sister Mercy attended, her gloves spotless, her face unreadable. After Lila, something in St. Mary's shifted. The cradle in the attic sat unwound for longer than usual. The drowning room went cold. The Reverend spent long hours alone, his sermons more clipped, his ledger unopened for weeks. But the change was not mercy. It was caution. Lila had broken the pattern, if only by inches, and patterns were everything. When autumn came, a new girl arrived, barely 4 years old, her face lit by the same kind of stubborn light that Lila once carried. Sister Mercy welcomed her with a smile, adjusting the small bonnet beneath her chin. Above them, in the attic, the gears waited, silent but never truly still. It happened without warning, though some would later claim they had felt it coming. A heaviness in the air, a strange stillness in the willows, a smell of smoke long before the first flame was seen. It was late winter when St. Mary's burned. The fire began in the upper floors where the attic windows glowed briefly before shattering outward, spitting embers into the night. The wind carried them down across the cotton fields like drifting seeds, each one searching for a place to land. The Reverend was the first seen outside, his coat thrown over his nightshirt, his expression calm despite the roaring above. Sister Mercy followed moments later, her gloves on, her hair covered, her face pale in the flicker of the flames. Staff members emerged in confusion, some clutching blankets, others only staring upward as the roof began to bow. No children were visible. That absence spread a quiet through the gathering crowd, even as the fire cracked and boomed, devouring the walls that had been scrubbed and polished for years. The town bucket line was formed too late. The flames had found the dry cedar beams, the polish and varnish that turned the orphanage into a lantern. Heat bent the iron gates, the white paint blistering and peeling in curls. Someone shouted to search the dormitories, but the staircase had already collapsed, throwing sparks into the hall below. In the orchard, the wind carried the heat against the trees, leaves curling in protest. The air was thick with the mingled stench of burning wood and something darker, sharper, the smell of things that should never burn. When dawn came, the building was a blackened husk. The walls had fallen inward, the roof reduced to charred ribs. The altar in the chapel was gone, the cedar turned to ash, the silver basin warped beyond recognition. In the wreckage, no bodies were found, not of the children, not of the barrels said to lie hidden beneath. The ground where the cellar had been collapsed into a shallow pit, steam rising faintly from its depths. The Reverend claimed the fire was an act of God, a cleansing of a house that had served its time. He spoke with a voice stripped of grief, telling the townsfolk that the children had been sent away in recent weeks to other homes, safe before the blaze. There were no witnesses to confirm it, but the crowd accepted his words as if believing them could keep something terrible from taking shape. Sister Mercy vanished from Fairhaven soon after, her departure unmarked by farewell. The ruins were left to the weather. Rain pooled in the hollow where the chapel once stood. Willows bent lower over the path and grass forced its way between the blackened bricks. Hunters avoided the area, swearing the air was colder there, the silence thicker. Those who passed close claimed they sometimes heard a faint, uneven clicking from where the attic had been, as though the cradle's gears had survived, turning unseen beneath the ash. The town spoke less of St. Mary's as the years passed, letting it slip into the comfortable half-memory reserved for things too dangerous to carry in full. But the orchard never bore fruit again, and the soil where the walls once stood stayed dark, no matter how hot the summer sun. Decades after the fire, the land where St. Mary's had stood was unrecognizable to the young, but not to those who had lived through its shadow. The white facade was gone, replaced by grass and weeds that grew thick over the scorched foundation. Only the orchard remained, its trees gnarled and bent, their branches reaching low as though still bearing a hidden weight. Children were warned away, told of sinkholes and snakes, but the truth was quieter and older. The ground still remembered. In 1852, a county law was passed requiring the public record of every child's death, along with mandatory examination by a physician unaffiliated with any religious institution. The law had no name, no plaque, no public ceremony, yet among the older townsfolk, it was called Mary's Rule. It came too late for the dozens who had disappeared behind those white walls, but it stood as a faint line drawn against the past. The site was eventually chosen for a memorial. A single stone, waist-high, was placed at the center of the old foundation. It bore no list of names. There were no records to draw from, only the inscription, "For the little ones who did not see the spring." Town leaders claimed the lack of names was to avoid errors, but some whispered it was because the Reverend's ledger had never been found. Those who whispered longer added that Sister Mercy had carried it away in her apron when she left, the clasps locked, the key around her neck. Visitors left flowers at the stone, sometimes pressed violets, though no one remembered why. In summer, the scent of lavender sometimes drifted through the grass, carrying on a wind that seemed to move against the usual currents. Hunters still swore that walking too close to the orchard brought the sound of something faint and mechanical, a halting click that did not belong to any bird or insect. Stories of the Reverend's fate were many. Some said he died in another parish preaching until his last breath. Others claimed he vanished entirely, his black coat and calm voice swallowed into another town that never learned to doubt him. Sister Mercy's name appeared in no census, no church record. A few old women claimed to have seen her years later in Savannah, her gloves still white, holding the hand of a small child whose face they could not forget, because it looked like one they had already buried. Fairhaven grew, its people turning toward the future, but the legacy of St. Mary's worked in silence. The law changed, inspections increased, and the idea that a place could hide death behind piety became harder to believe. And yet, in unspoken moments, they knew it had happened here. They had lived beside it. They had looked at the white facade and seen only what they wished to see. The stone at the memorial weathered over time, its inscription fading until the words were more felt than read. Children on school outings ran their fingers across it without knowing why it made them uneasy. In the evenings, when the last light slipped behind the trees, the orchard's shadows stretched across the grass, long and thin, touching the stone as if to remind it of something unfinished. The truth of St. Mary's would never be fully known. Too many names had been left off the record, too many pieces buried in unmarked soil or hidden in drawers that would never be opened. The Reverend's sermons were gone, Sister Mercy's hands would never be ungloved, and the brine-filled barrels in the sealed cellar would remain undisturbed beneath the ruin. And yet the question lingered, not in the history books, but in the minds of those who stood before the memorial and felt the wrongness in the air. How could something so deliberate, so methodical, happen in silence for so long? How many people had stood within reach of the truth and chosen to turn away? The narrator's voice lowers here, the final words sinking in like a shadow over the heart. Evil does not always come with shouting or blood on its hands. Sometimes it sits in a clean room, smiling, patient, waiting for its turn. And when its turn is done, it leaves no trail that the living dare follow. What do you think? Could this happen again?